I was totally caught up in the cultural mores of that time. Ole Miss did for me what a great university is supposed to do. It opened this country boy's mind and soul up to some challenging new ideas. And the teacher to whom I owe the most was Dr. Jim Silver. And I can't pass up this event tonight without talking about what he did for me, but more than that, what he did for this university and for this state. Jim Silver personified what a great teacher is supposed to be. Jim Silver helped me climb out of the closed society that he later wrote about. That was a dangerous role for anybody in Mississippi in those days, for a member of the faculty at Ole Miss. And for that role, he was denounced and his life was threatened, and he ultimately was really driven from Mississippi. He was called a communist and worse. One of the incidents that he was the victim of involved an investigation by the legislature. It was the result of some of the reports that had come out from some of the students here at Ole Miss. Some of us who had been in law school the year before were elected to the legislature. In fact, there were 11 of us who were law students enrolled in law school here at Ole Miss who were members of the legislature in 1948 and 1950. Well, in the session, the 1950 session, this was just as Joe McCarthy was beginning to make his move, finding a communist under every tree. There was an executive session of the legislature, and I didn't know what was going on. But the next day, I don't know whether you can see this or not, but these were about the largest headlines I had ever seen since Pearl Harbor. And those headlines read, "Solons in secret session to hear red names. Name Ole Miss profs." And one of those named was Dr. James Silver, professor of history at Ole Miss. Joe McCarthy, like this member of the legislature, got up and pulled a sheaf of papers out of his pocket and said, "I have here the names of these communists or communist sympathizers," of whom Jim Silver was the most prominent. Well, I've done a lot of things as a politician and as a public official that I have not been proud of. But let me tell you one of the things I am still most proud of, and that has caused me to keep this old newspaper clipping for over 60 years. After this attack on these Ole Miss professors, this article says, Representative William Winter of Grenada, a former student in the Ole Miss School of Law who is still studying there, defended the teaching staff of the university. Winter, a member of Omicron Delta Kappa leadership fraternity, especially defended that organization and Dr. James Silver. Both the organization and Dr. Silver have been criticized by certain legislators for the political views of nationally known speakers that they have brought to the school for lecture appointments. Those were the most valuable experiences that I had in hearing these so-called subversive speakers come to Ole Miss and talk about things that we needed to hear about. And Dr. Silver was my mentor, of whom I shall always be proud and for whom I shall always be grateful. And so when we dedicate Silver Pond on September 30th, I hope to be there. Now if you will suffer me just a few more minutes, because I know you want to hear Robert Kayat and this combo tonight as much as I do. Early in the last century, there was a man named Robert Henry who was the owner, publisher, and editor of the Jackson Clarion Ledger. Mr. Henry wrote a book of memoirs entitled Editors I Have Known. In just a very few minutes, I want to adopt that as the title of my remarks tonight. I consider it my good fortune to have lived, as all of us here tonight have, through some of the most interesting times in human history. So much of the richness of those years for me has involved the association which I've had with newspapers and their editors. Much of who I am is a product of that influence that has come to me from these relationships, particularly those involving the Mississippi. I cannot begin to list all of the individuals who have written the words and taken the stands that have made so much difference in my life. I do not know where to start. But tonight, let me just confine my remarks to just a few of my fellow Mississippian editors and staffers. Let me begin there. There were 32 men, I emphasize men, there were 32 men who preceded me as editor of the Mississippi. There have been 68 men and women since I was editor. I knew 22 of my predecessors, including Forrest Cooper, the first one who became a distinguished attorney and later a member of the Board of Trustees of the Institution of Higher Learning. All of us latter-day editors owe a great deal to that pantheon of leaders who set the Mississippian on the right course and established the high standards that has marked its way. All of them were exceptional student leaders, and all had successful careers in many different fields that brought some of them national recognition. 2 were presidents of prestigious universities. Several were eminent academicians. A number were distinguished lawyers, including Dan Russell, who served for over 40 years as a federal judge. The federal courthouse in Gulfport bears his name. Still others were captains of business and industry, including the CEO of a major airline. All are deserving of our gratitude and respect. I wish I could talk about each one of those whom I knew. But now let me talk again briefly about those who were my contemporaries and with whom I worked on the paper beginning in 1940. First, there was my unforgettable first editor, Tom Hammond, of whom I've already spoken, with some disregard for historical accuracy. He was, in fact, one of Ole Miss's most intellectual graduates, who taught me so much. He was for many years a distinguished professor of Russian history at the University of Virginia, and during the Cold War was regarded as perhaps this country's most respected authority on the Soviet Union. 30 years later, Elise and I were driving through Charlottesville, and we stopped on the campus there of the University of Virginia, and we looked across the campus, and I saw a man whom I had not seen in 30 years, and I said to Elise, "That's Tom Hammond." And I went over and spoke to him, and we had lunch and renewed revived those old memories. My second editor was Louis Silver from Rolling Fork, another scholar of the first order who had a highly successful career in journalism, becoming the news editor of U.S. News and World Report. My immediate successor as editor was one of my closest friends and served as my sports editor. When I left for the Army in June 1943, Joe Wagner and I made a pledge to each other that we would meet in front of Fulton Chapel after the war and plan our political careers. And after several months as editor, he was inducted into the Army. We kept up with each other by V-mail, not email, by V-mail. But in January of 1945, my letter to him came back stamped, undeliverable, KIA. He'd been killed 5 days before Christmas by a German shell in the fighting along the Rhine River. When they brought his body back to Carthage after the war was over, I was a pallbearer at his funeral and later spoke at the dedication of a state highway named for him in his home county, Joe Wagner. The other two wartime editors I have already mentioned. They were those intrepid women, Miriam Horn and Huldah Cousins, who broke the glass ceiling before any of us men thought about there being a glass ceiling. And then began the post-war generation. I knew almost all of them in that generation, at least for the next 25 years. They were courageous and visionary, and they contributed to helping break Mississippi out of what Dr. Silver called the closed society. The first of that group to take the reins was Tom Bordeaux, a young veteran who came out of the Naval Air Corps in the fall of 1945 and who was elected a few weeks later as editor of the Mississippian in the spring of 1946. He planned to go to the Columbia University School of Journalism, and had he done so, I think he might have followed in the footsteps of Turner Catledge and become the editor of the New York Times. He was that good. But he wound up at the Ole Miss Law School to become one of its most distinguished graduates, and only this year was inducted into the second class into the Law School Alumni Hall of Fame.